I was having dinner with an old friend in Shenzhen last month, a guy who made his fortune in the 2010s. For years, his life followed a predictable, almost rhythmic pattern. Every few years, he'd buy a shell, an empty concrete apartment. For the next 6 months, he'd be obsessed. He'd show me photos of premium tiles, debate the merits of German-engineered kitchen vents, and talk about the momentum of the market with a giddy, almost electric energy. He wasn't just buying a floor plan. He was single-handedly activating a massive chain of factories, truckers, and designers. Back then, his savings weren't sitting idle. They were the high-octane fuel for the nation's industrial engine. But this time, the energy was gone. He told me he's playing it safe now. He stopped buying shells. When I asked if he'd stopped spending altogether, he laughed and showed me his phone photos of a high-end ski trip in Xinjiang and a receipt for an expensive omakase dinner. "I'm spending plenty," he said, "but the rest, it just stays in the bank. It's safer there." On the surface, he looks like the perfect modern consumer. He's moving towards services, enjoying life, and keeping a healthy balance sheet. But there's a quiet structural crisis hidden in that shift that the mainstream headlines completely miss. We're constantly told that the China problem is a lack of spending, that people are simply too scared to open their wallets. But my friend is opening his wallet. The real issue is a profound demand mismatch. For 20 years, housing wasn't just a place to live. It was a unique accounting blind spot that turned private savings into massive physical demand for everything from cement to refrigerators. It was the bridge between the household and the heavy industrial soul of the country. Now that bridge has collapsed. Even as people spend on ephemeral pleasures like travel or dining, they've left a massive echoing void in the real economy. The demand hole left by real estate is so vast you could buy 1 million designer shirts and still not fill it. We're witnessing a fundamental breakage. A state doubling down on building a high-tech manufacturing superpower, while its citizens are retreating into a defensive, low-velocity savings model. It raises a haunting question. If the domestic consumer is no longer buying the output of the modern industrial system, who is this new economy actually for?
That is, I think, the central tension of the entire decade. And frankly, it's the only dynamic that matters right now if you want to understand the global economy in 2026.
It feels that big.
That anecdote about your friend in Shenzhen, I mean, that's not just a story about changing tastes or one guy getting older. It represents a tectonic plate shift.
Right.
The old rhythm, build, sell, consume, repeat, that is functionally obsolete. Yeah. We are looking at a landscape that is completely, and I mean completely, unrecognizable from the boom years of the 2010s.
The entire machine has changed.
The machinery that drove the second largest economy on Earth has been dismantled, and a new, much more complex and frankly, much riskier machine is being built in its place.
I want to take that machine apart because we see the headlines about GDP targets or, export numbers, and it often feels like static noise. Our mission here is to cut through that. Yeah. We need to unpack the 3 massive pillars that are attempting to replace that old housing engine. We have what we're calling the fiscal shift, the industrial bet, and the monetary mystery.
3 perfect pillars. You have the government finding a new way to pay its bills, the factories finding a new product to build, and the households finding a new place to hide their money. It covers everything.
To really get our heads around this, we have to look at the ground level. I was reviewing some notes from a colleague in Chengdu who spent time with a man named Old Liao. For 20 years, Liao was a foreman at a local steel yard. His entire life rhythm was dictated by the rising skeletons of apartment towers. In his world, a house wasn't just a place to live. It was the ultimate sponge that soaked up every yuan earned by the families in his district. When people bought those concrete boxes, Liao's yard hummed with activity, turning household savings into the literal rebar of the city. But, well, the music stopped. Now, Liao spends his afternoons watching the cranes stand still. He sees his neighbors putting their money back into simple bank deposits, sterile and quiet, rather than into the investment of a new home. The engine that turned private dreams into industrial heat has shifted gears. The central government is now stepping in with sovereign bonds to act as the new foreman, trying to build a different kind of national infrastructure, because the old, localized housing engine simply can't pull the weight of the economy anymore.
Old Liao is the perfect protagonist for this because he sits right at the intersection of the physical economy and the fiscal economy. We need to explain specifically why his crane standing still matters for the government's bank account.
Exactly. It's not just about a slow construction site.
This is the whole concept of land finance. For 2 decades, when a developer bought a plot of land to build the tower Liao was working on, they paid a massive, and I mean massive, land transfer fee to the local government.
It was the primary revenue stream for these cities, right?
It was everything. Look, in many Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, these fees constituted up to 40% of the local budget. 40%.
That's a staggering number.
That money paid for the subway Liao takes to work. It paid for the parks where his grandkids play. It subsidized the local bus system. The housing engine was actually the local government funding engine.
So it was a self-perpetuating cycle. People bought houses, which funded the city, which made the city a better place to live, which made people want to buy more houses.
A perfect loop. When the housing market froze, that revenue evaporated. I mean, it's just vanished. Broke.
So the state had a choice, a really stark choice. Let the local governments collapse and services shut down, or find a completely new way to pay for things.
Exactly. The central government in Beijing looked at this broken model and realized they just couldn't rely on private developers to fund public goods anymore. So they have deployed a really sophisticated mechanism involving special sovereign bonds and these things called policy banks.
Sovereign bonds and policy banks. Now, what is actually happening mechanically? How does the money move?
Mechanically, the central government is leveraging its own credit rating, which, is still very strong, to issue massive amounts of debt on the open market.
And we're talking huge sums of money.
We are talking about 4.4 trillion yuan in special bond issuance projected for 2025 and again in 2026. It's a fire hose of cash. The money doesn't just go into a general account to pay for, say, pensions. It is often directed through these policy banks.
And these are banks like the China Development Bank or the Export-Import Bank, not the commercial ones we might know.
Correct. And the Agricultural Development Bank of China. These are not commercial banks. You or I cannot walk into the China Development Bank and open a checking account. That's not what they do.
They have a different mandate.
Their mandate is not profit, it is policy. These institutions answer directly to the State Council. They are the financial arms of the state's will. So when the central government wants to stimulate the economy or build something specific, it capitalizes these banks or directly tells them, lend to these specific projects.
So instead of a private developer borrowing money from a commercial bank to build a condo, the policy bank is now lending money to whom? And to build what?
And that is the absolute core of the shift to what they call new infrastructure. Since old Liao isn't needed to build apartments anymore, the state is trying to retask all that industrial capacity, the steel, the cement, the labor, to build things that serve the long-term national interests. We are seeing massive investments in 5G networks, artificial intelligence data centers, ultra-high voltage power lines to carry renewable energy across the country, and these enormous clean energy bases out in the Gobi Desert.
I've read about the East Data West Computing initiatives.
They are literally building massive server farms in the western provinces where renewable energy is cheap and the climate is cool enough to cool the servers, and connecting them to the eastern cities via high-speed fiber optics. This requires steel, it requires cement, it requires tons of copper. Ideally, it keeps old Liao's steel yard in business, just making a different product.
Right. I mean, a data center isn't the same as a condo tower from a financial perspective.
The catch is the fiscal logic, and crucially, the return on investment. When a local government sold a piece of land for a condo, they got cash immediately. It was liquid, it was fast. They could use it to pay salaries that month.
But with new infrastructure.
The payback period could be decades. A data center might boost the digital economy in 2035, but it doesn't generate quick cash flow today to pay the teachers or the sanitation workers. It has what economists call positive externalities. It's good for society, but it doesn't fill the budget hole right now.
So the velocity of the return on that capital is just so much slower.
Much slower and much more uncertain. And there is also the risk of redundancy, which is a big concern. Just like we had ghost cities of empty apartments.
We could get ghost servers.
Exactly. Infrastructure built before there is actual commercial demand for it, simply because the local government needed to spend the bond money to hit a GDP target. Every province wants its own high-tech park, its own AI hub, whether it makes economic sense or not.
It feels like a massive centralization of power then. The old model was decentralized in a way. Every city sold its own land and funded itself. The new model is the central government issuing bonds and directing the flow of capital from Beijing.
It is arguably the most significant centralization of fiscal power in 40 years. The state is making a huge bet. They are betting that they can be a better capital allocator than the market was.
A bet that strategic assets, the grid, the data centers, will eventually yield a higher return to the nation than another luxury apartment block.
But in the interim, for the local economy where old Liao lives, the immediate cash crunch is very, very real.
So we have the government trying to build this high-tech backbone. And that, of course, requires hardware. It requires manufacturing on a huge scale. If you aren't building houses, you have to build something else to keep the factories running.
This is the industrial gamble. And it's not just about keeping the lights on, it's a deliberate strategy to dominate the technologies of the future.
This connects so perfectly to a post I saw on a social media forum. It's from a young engineer named Chen, who works at a massive solar panel factory in Anhui province.
Oh.
Chen described the sheer, breathtaking scale of their production lines. He said it's a masterpiece of efficiency, churning out new 3 technologies at a pace the domestic market couldn't possibly swallow alone. Chen wrote about the pride of seeing his work shipped to deserts in the Middle East and rooftops in Europe. But he also talked about this tension. While some people, in the West see this as overcapacity, for Chen and his team, it is a global mission. They believe they are producing the physical goods the world needs for a green transition because the domestic service sector isn't yet ready to absorb all that industrial energy.
Right.
And when I read his account, it reminds me that China's strategy isn't just about internal numbers. It's about a deliberate choice to be the world's high-tech workshop. And while this creates immense friction in global trade, from a purely human perspective, it's about thousands of Chens whose livelihood depends on the world needing what they build.
Chen's reality is the perfect inverse of old Liao's. While construction is contracting, advanced manufacturing is just exploding. We call them the new 3: electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and solar cells. The scale is almost hard to comprehend. Okay, so in 2024, the clean energy sector alone contributed a record 10% of China's GDP.
10%. That is a staggering figure. It physically overtook real estate sales in value.
Think about the psychological shift that represents. For 20 years, real estate was the kingmaker. Now it's green tech. They produced over 13 million new energy vehicles in a single year.
13 million.
And their solar capacity is growing exponentially, something like tenfold in 5 years. They are installing more solar in a year than most countries has in total.
But Chen hit on something critical in his post. He mentioned that the domestic market can't swallow it all. And he's spending his money on ski trips and omakase dinners. He isn't buying a new EV every year or a new solar panel every week.
This is the service industrial mismatch. It is, I think, the core structural problem of the entire economy right now. As an economy matures, its citizens, like your friend, naturally pivot their consumption towards services. They want better healthcare, better education, better travel experiences, better food. It's a natural evolution. But the government's investment strategy, the one funded by those sovereign bonds we talked about, is still heavily weighted toward the supply side of physical goods. They're subsidizing factories, upgrading robotics, and pouring cheap credit into manufacturing.
So you have a population that wants to consume soft luxury, but an industrial base that's been turbocharged to produce hard goods.
Exactly. And you cannot export a haircut. You cannot export a ski trip to Xinjiang. Those have to be consumed globally. But you can export a BYD Seagull. You can export a solar module.
So because the domestic consumer is shifting to services and, as we'll see, saving cash, there is this massive surplus of physical goods that simply has nowhere to go but abroad.
It has to be exported. There's no other choice, which leads directly to the international accusation of overcapacity.
But you mentioned there are 2 completely different ways to view this.
And it is absolutely vital to understand the engineer's view, Vision 2, if you will, which is the one that Chen embodies.
Okay, so Vision 1 is the Western view.
Vision 1, the view from Europe or the US, is that this is dumping. They see cheap state loans and massive subsidies, and they say it's unfair competition that's destroying our local jobs. It's a question of fairness.
Why? If a local factory can't compete with a state-backed giant, it goes out of business.
Of course. But Vision 2, the perspective from Chen's factory floor and from Beijing, is completely different. They look at the climate crisis and say, the world is burning. We have figured out how to make the fire extinguishers cheaper and faster than anyone else on Earth.
If the ultimate goal is global decarbonization, shouldn't we want the cheapest, most efficient solar panels possible, regardless of where they're made?
That is precisely their argument. They view their dominance not as market manipulation, but as the natural result of superior engineering, ruthless efficiency, and incredible supply chain integration. They are, in their view, driving down the green premium for the entire planet.
But of course, politics doesn't work on pure efficiency. It works on jobs. And when those cheap panels hit Europe or the US, they threaten local industries.
Which is why we are now seeing massive tariffs being erected. This China Shock 2.0 is real.
And this is where this idea of the red supply chain becomes so relevant, right?
It's a direct response. As the West puts up walls, China is aggressively, and I mean obsessively, localizing every single component of the supply chain. They are removing any foreign dependency. If you look at the trade data, foreign firms are divesting or reducing their footprint, but Chinese domestic firms are stepping in to take their place. They want to control everything from the raw polysilicon to the finished solar panel.
I've also heard about this strange phenomenon called phantom trade. What exactly is that?
It's a really interesting statistical anomaly we're seeing in the customs data, particularly across the Taiwan Strait and with certain Southeast Asian partners like Vietnam.
The numbers don't add up.
They just don't match. The value of exports leaving China doesn't always match the value of imports being recorded on the other side. This suggests a few things are happening. It could be capital flight being disguised as trade misinvoicing, or more likely, it's goods being routed through third countries to try and avoid tariffs.
So a solar panel goes from China to Vietnam, gets a made in Vietnam sticker, and then goes to Europe.
It just shows that despite the barriers, this massive volume of goods is trying to find a way out, like water under high pressure. It will find the cracks.
Yeah. We have the state pumping money into infrastructure. That's the fiscal part. We have the factories churning out goods for export because the locals won't buy them. That's the industrial part. Question, why won't the locals buy them? Or rather, where's all the money that used to buy the apartments?
This brings us to our third pillar, the monetary mystery. And this is where we meet the most important character in our entire story, more important than old Liao or Chen.
Try to imagine a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Zhang in Hangzhou sitting in a bank lobby looking at her mobile app. She represents the trapped M2 supply we talk about in technical reports. For years, her money moved fast, buying property, renovating, fueling the velocity of the M1 money supply. Now, her savings sit in a long-term certificate of deposit. Safe, but stagnant. She told a local journalist she is waiting for a sign. She's not unwilling to spend. She's waiting for a new channel that feels as solid as brick and mortar once did. This is the heart of the divergence between M1 and M2. Her money is a dormant force, waiting for the state to direct it toward the next high-tech industrial frontier. Looking at Mrs. Zhang's caution, I feel a sense of the immense pressure on the state to get this right. We are seeing a massive psychological transition where the public is trading the excitement of the real estate boom for the quiet security of the financial system, waiting for the next big thing to believe in. It's a delicate moment of transition that requires more than just policy. It requires the restoration of a new kind of industrial faith.
Mrs. Zhang is the absolute embodiment of the liquidity trap. To understand her behavior and the behavior of millions like her, we have to look at this thing economists call the scissors gap between M1 and M2.
Okay, M1, M2, it sounds technical.
It is. M1 is what we call narrow money. It's the cash in your pocket, the money in your checking account, basically. Money that is ready to be spent right now. It represents economic velocity, action.
And M2?
M2 is broad money. It includes all of M1, plus all the savings deposits, time deposits, and those certificates of deposit that Mrs. Zhang has. It represents the total store of wealth in the system.
So M1 is the river flowing, and M2 is the entire reservoir behind the dam.
And right now, the reservoir M2 is overflowing. It is growing at a historic rate because people like Mrs. Zhang are saving every single penny they can. They're pouring water into the reservoir.
But the river, M1, is drying up.
Exactly. Its growth rate is anemic, sometimes even negative. And the scissors gap is just the name for that divergence on the chart. The two lines, which used to move together, have split apart like a pair of scissors.
Why isn't it flowing?
Because of a concept called the balance sheet recession. This is a theory that was made famous by the economist Richard Koo when he was analyzing Japan's lost decades.
How does it work?
Yes. Mrs. Zhang's primary asset, like for most middle-class families, was her apartment. For 20 years, that asset went up in value. She felt rich, her net worth was growing, so she spent money. Maybe she borrowed against the apartment to start a business.
She had confidence?
She had confidence, and she had collateral. Now that asset has depreciated, it's worth less than it was 2 years ago, so even if her income hasn't changed, her net worth on paper has dropped. This is the negative wealth effect.
And her psychological reaction to that is to shift into repair mode.
She stops thinking about expansion and starts thinking about defense. She prioritizes paying down debt and hoarding cash over consumption or new investment. She is trying to repair her household balance sheet.
And when millions of households all do this at the exact same time,
demand collapses. And this is why the government's response, which has been to lower interest rates, isn't really working.
look, make money cheaper to encourage borrowing and spending.
But in a balance sheet recession, interest rates lose their power. Mrs. Zhang doesn't care if a new loan is cheap. She doesn't want more debt at any price. She wants safety. This is the very definition of a liquidity trap. You can flood the system with money, but if the psychology is broken, the money just sits there in the reservoir.
And it's not just households, is it? Businesses are doing the same thing.
Absolutely. Private businesses are facing huge uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, weak consumer demand. So instead of investing in a new factory or hiring new workers, they are parking their cash in the bank, just like Mrs. Zhang.
This creates a really strange, almost paradoxical dilemma for the banks. They are sitting on this mountain of deposits from Mrs. Zhang and others, but they have no one safe to lend it to in the private sector.
It leads to what some have called the Great Wall of regulation and the closed loop we mentioned earlier. The banks are legally obligated to pay interest to Mrs. Zhang on her deposit. They need to find a return on that cash.
But the old reliable customer, the property developer, is toxic. And small private businesses are seen as too risky.
The banks take that money from Mrs. Zhang's savings account and they buy government bonds. The same bonds the central government is issuing to fund the new infrastructure.
The government issues bonds to build infrastructure. The people's savings, funneled through the banks, are used to buy those bonds. The government then spends the money through the policy banks.
It is a completely closed circuit of state-financed growth. The private sector is increasingly being sidelined in terms of credit allocation. And you have to remember, the shadow banking system, which used to be the Wild West where risky private companies could get their funding, has been systematically dismantled for stability reasons. So that channel of fast money is gone. We are left with slow, safe, state-directed capital.
So let's zoom out and try to connect all three of these pillars here. We have the fiscal shift, moving away from land sales to sovereign debt. We have the industrial bet, moving from construction to high-tech manufacturing. And we have the monetary mystery, where savings are high but spending velocity is low.
It looks like an L-shaped trajectory.
Meaning we've had a sharp drop and now we're just going to crawl along the bottom for a while.
Essentially, yes. It means the era of double-digit hypergrowth is over. That's historical fact now. We have stepped down to a new plateau of much more moderate growth. Maybe it's 4%, maybe it's 3%. The recovery isn't a V-shape where we bounce right back to the old highs. We are grinding out a new, much slower reality.
And this massive structural transition has a human cost. It's not just numbers on a chart.
This is what some analysts are starting to call the new class war, or at least a new social tension. The old economy construction and all the services around it was incredibly labor-intensive. It employed millions and millions of people, like old Liao with a high school education.
It was the engine of upward mobility for a generation.
But the new economy, the automated factories, the AI data centers, the green tech is capital intensive. It needs far fewer humans, and the humans it does need must be highly educated engineers like Chen.
So you have a fundamental mismatch in the labor market now, too.
That's why youth unemployment is so stubbornly high. The sectors that used to absorb university graduates, tech, internet services, finance, real estate, are all consolidating or shrinking. The advanced manufacturing sector is booming, but a robot doesn't take income tax and it doesn't buy lunch at the local noodle shop. The multiplier effect is much smaller.
This brings us back to the fundamental vulnerability of the entire model. If the domestic consumer, Mrs. Zhang, remains in this defensive crouch and the state keeps pumping money into the supply side, where Chen works,
then the reliance on the rest of the world to buy that supply becomes existential. It's not a choice. It's a mathematical necessity. If the global markets close up, if Vision 1 prevails and heavy tariffs block Chinese goods, then the pressure cooker has no release valve.
It really feels like a race against time. The state is trying to keep the plane flying while completely switching out the engines in midair, from real estate to high-tech.
And they are hoping they can complete the switch before the passengers Liao, Chen, and Zhang lose patience, or before the external environment becomes too hostile and the fuel of global demand runs out. It is, without a doubt, the most complex and high-stakes economic engineering project in modern history.
We spend so much time asking when the Chinese consumer will wake up and start buying again. But perhaps we are looking at the wrong variable. The state has made its choice. It is building a fortress of technological self-reliance and industrial might, fueled by the very savings its citizens are too anxious to spend. The machinery is humming, the solar panels are shipping, and the sovereign bonds are issuing. But in this grand state-directed transition, where efficiency is the god and production is the goal, we have to ask ourselves one final thing. If an economy becomes the world's most efficient factory, but its own people are too cautious to buy the product, the system serves the production, and the citizen merely fuels the system.